We get some assurance that you don't put up, you see, your own nominees, you see, but that we do get people who will express our voice in the parliament. That Mr. Gandhi had to accept, so he accepted that, you see. Of course, we had the benefit of it only in one election, in 1937, you see. There you will see that the Federation swept the poll. Gandhi was not able to get a single candidate of his party elected.
He worked entirely as a politician.
As a politician. He was never a Mahatma, and I refuse to call him Mahatma. You see, I've never in my life called him Mahatma. He doesn't deserve that title. Not even from the point of view of his morality. You see?
I'll start with Jai Bhim, because this salute is to the Ambedkarite movement what Lal Salam is to comrades, and Azadi is to Kashmiris, what Black Power is to civil rights. Black Power salute is to civil rights. Though we chose the date that was available to us at Habitat Center, to whom I'm thankful, I'm glad this book is being discussed on a day that happens to be Kanshiram's birthday. B.R. Ambedkar, we can all see him, looms on us like the sun. I have with us Asad Zaidi, who is going to be in conversation with Arundhati Roy. I would request both of them to come onto the stage. Asad is a dear friend who has been supportive of Navayana since I met him in 2003, made a trip to Delhi just to meet him when we had just started Navayana. He runs 3 Essays Press, which was started just a year before or two before Navayana came into existence. And he's a well-known Hindi poet. A sample of his book is left outside for you to see. It's not for sale, he told me. Even the sample is not there, but he's pretty famous. You can just Google him and find out about his poetry. Then there's Arundhati Roy, and we have traveled a long way, and our conversation began with me asking her. She figures in one of the first 4 Navayana books, Touchable Tales, where I'd asked her about the representation of Dalits by Dalits in autobiographies. It was a dialogue, and then that's when I asked her, have you read Ambedkar? She said, no. So that's where the conversation began. I sent her Annihilation of Caste, and it's been this 10-year conversation around this book that we have had that is reflected in her introduction. Thank you, Arundhati. There have been some intense conversations that have already been happening around the book for nearly 80 years. This evening we'll be merely continuing that conversation. Let me begin with what Ambedkar says at one point in Annihilation of Caste. Caste is no doubt primarily the breath of the Hindus, but the Hindus have fouled the air all over. I mean, including, I would imagine, this Habitat Center where we are caste-breathing people. In 1936, when the Hindu reformist group, the Jatpat Todak Mandal of Lahore, invited Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar to deliver its annual lecture, it asked for and received the text of the speech in advance. It found the contents, in its own words, in Ambedkar's words, unbearable. Ambedkar had anticipated this, for he begins his undelivered speech with an injunction from the Manusmriti, Varnanam Brahmano Guru. Among the Varnas, the Brahman is the teacher, preceptor. An untouchable, however qualified, being asked to preside over a conference of caste Hindus in 1936 was, as Ambedkar himself points out, an act of great daring. For as Ambedkar says, I quote, I have questioned the authority of the Mahatma whom they revere, as he was doing so in the BBC interview in 1955. He continued to hold that position. They hate me. To them, I'm a snake in the garden. The Mandal will no doubt be asked by politically minded Hindus to explain why it called me to fill this place of honor. I shall not be surprised if political Hindus regard this as an insult. Today, politically minded Dalits, at least a section of them, have regarded this act of Navayana, run by a person born into the Brahmin Varna, annotating it, and getting a writer of the diligence and intelligence of Arundhati Roy to write an introduction, as a historical reversal of that insult. This is perhaps as it should be. Ambedkar's utterances in this undelivered speech are deeply disturbing, perhaps even more so for a Dalit. I quote, the Mandal knows best the reasons which led it to travel to Bombay to select a president, to fix upon a man so repugnant to the Hindus, and to descend so low in the scale as to select an Antyaja, and untouchable, to address an audience of the Savarnas. As for myself, you will allow me to say that I've accepted the invitation much against my will, and also against the will of many of my fellow untouchables. I know the Hindus are sick of me. He goes on to say he's a persona non grata for them. And he is happy to give his own views in his own platforms. This responsibility has been thrust upon him. If this is the painful story of the origin of a text that is among the most radical and important texts ever written in this subcontinent, then surely those who are today saying this gesture of a Brahmin annotating the text or a non-Dalit introducing it to take it to a wider audience are acts that need to be viewed with suspicion and sometimes even contempt. Would such an audience have turned up today, such an audience as you, had turned up today if this were a Dalit-run, Dalit-led enterprise? Would Caravan and Outlook give so much space for a Dalit to speak? There's no history of that. These are questions that we cannot duck. But then these are the very questions of representation and privilege, questions of structure and power, that the edition of the book we are discussing today is all about. Freedom of expression is not an absolute value. Some have more of it, some have none of it. It is just like the right to vote was for Ambedkar. He was talking about the double vote in the BBC interview. He wanted to augment the value of the Dalit by giving them a double vote. And you'll find that in this edition of Annihilation of Caste, especially in Arundhati Roy's introduction, it has one of the finest defenses of the double vote and critiques of Gandhi, something that Ambedkar was himself doing. Yes, there are hundreds of editions of Annihilation of Caste and they're freely available on the internet. Yet, the privileged castes have had the privilege to ignore this text. They've had the privilege to jettison any dialogue on Ambedkar's radical ideas carried forward by the Dalit movements of India for over 60 years. While a majority of the privileged castes are blissfully ignorant of its existence, Annihilation of Caste has been printed and reprinted like most of Ambedkar's large oeuvre by small, mostly Dalit-owned presses and read by mostly Dalit readers for over 7 decades. It now has the curious distinction of being one of the most obscure as well as one of the most widely read books in India. I mean, it would sell 100 times more than Chetan Bhagat, Arundhati Roy, everybody put together, I'm just telling you. But we don't know, it's in a separate space. Now, that's the comparison being made on the internet, I'm sorry. This in itself, this separation, this in itself illumines the iron grid of the caste system. Punita Pandian, editor of Dalit Murase, a Tamil monthly, on seeing the Navayana edition of Annihilation of Caste, wrote to me saying, since 2007, Dalit Murase in Tamil has published 17,000 copies of Annihilation of Caste, 3 editions. He ended this letter saying, but there's not a single debate in Tamil Nadu so far. I'm glad you made a national debate in a single day, unquote. But someone asked on Facebook, पता नहीं बुक फेयर्स में ये लोग सब जो जाते हैं, जैसे हैबिटेट सेंटर में आज लोग हम इकट्ठे हुए हैं, कभी समयक प्रकाशन या गौतम बुक सेंटर, अभी मैं फॉरवर्ड प्रेस की भी बात करूंगा, यहाँ जाते हैं कि नहीं कभी? My question also, to add to this, would be, do we keep Ambedkar confined to Samayak, Gautam and Dalit Murase and thousands of such Dalit platforms? A related and important question to be asked is, what is it that we do with privilege? Sharpen it into a weapon and wield it against the very banyan tree of Brahmanism that entangles us with its roots in the air? Or should we just enjoy the shaded comfort of the tree? I believe it is the former that this edition of Annihilation of Caste attempts. Navayana has been an attempt to create a platform to engage with those who are smug about caste privilege so that they interrogate that privilege. Navayana is, in my view, a necessary historical mistake. It will pass, but for now, it will stay. This annotated edition of Annihilation of Caste comes in a series of books that Navayana has done over the last 10 years. Most of them are out there. By Bhagwan Das, Namdev Dasal, Sharmila Rege, Namdev Neemgade, N.D. Rajkumar, Kancha Ailaya, Meena Kandasamy, Premanand Gajvi, Siddhalingaya, Gail Omvet, Balagopal, Gogu Shamala, Durga Bhavyam, Anand Tiltumde, and many more. If Ambedkar is the writer I most admire among those dead, Arundhati Roy is one of the writers I most admire among the living. And in this edition of the book, I have managed to sandwich myself between both of them. That's my privilege and honor. While I can understand the anxiety and politics over who gets to introduce or annotate Ambedkar, I do strongly believe that Ambedkar belongs to us all. After all, annihilation of caste is something that those who have caste need to undertake. The caste Hindus, as Ambedkar called them, touchables, he called them. I mean, when I read touchables every time in Ambedkar, I think it's a slur. He uses it with anger. And I believe Ambedkar is like the sun. He's as universal as the sun. He illumines the lives of Dalits as much as he illumines the lives of non-Dalits, whether most Dalits like it or not, whether all Dalits like it or not. He's the sun that, as Namdev Dasal writes in his powerful ode to Ambedkar in 1972, which comes in Golpita, he's the sun that moves only from one freedom to the next. Annihilation of caste is Ambedkar's call for rebirth and regeneration in this life. His was a call to destroy something ugly in those who practice caste so that they may have a sense of genuine beauty of the humanity nesting in each person. Dasal again. Everyone is, as a matter of fact, as complete as the sun. Speaking to a Dalit audience in 1942, Ambedkar said, "The battle to me is a matter of joy. The battle is in the fullest sense spiritual. There is nothing material or social in it. For ours is a battle not for wealth or for power. Ours is a battle for freedom. It is a battle for the reclamation of human personality." Unquote. You can apply this anywhere. To the struggles of Romas in Hungary, in Kashmir or Manipur, or the LGBT struggle against 377. Ambedkar genuinely wanted the privileged caste too to get in touch with their human personality, which is smothered by caste. Ambedkar was, and a section of Dalits today is, deeply skeptical of such a possibility. I respect that skepticism. It is for the Hindus to make a belated effort, or anybody who practices caste, to make a belated effort to prove them wrong. It is time to rid the air of the foulness of caste. Now I'll hand over I had to make a little statement because there has been a lot of questioning. I don't know those who are here familiar with social media debates. This is partly a response to that, and the book is its own solid defense. Arundhati Roy will speak first, and then there'll be a conversation, as I said, a 77-year-old conversation that is going to continue. And after that, there'll be, you can purchase the books outside, which are available at a discount for 400 rupees. And those who want to get it signed should subsequently queue up on one side, and Arundhati Roy will, I can't get Ambedkar to sign, I could just bring his voice here.
Thank you everybody for coming. It's a very, very difficult task really to talk about the enormity of this book and the implications of it, and the task of having written the introduction to it, which is a great honor for me. As Anand said, it's a book, it's a text that has existed for 80 years. It's been translated into many Indian languages. It's been circulated. And yet, it's actually a very complex text. It's a very rich text. Ambedkar just ranges from Prussia to Ireland to Rome. He talks about philosophical context. He talks about big philosophical ideas. He throws in many Sanskrit shlokas. He doesn't explain them. And so the difference between this edition of Annihilation of Caste and I think the others that exist is that these references have, the annotations try to explain these references. And when you read it along with that, it suddenly just gets an incredible context, When I first read it, of course, it was without the annotations. And as many of you might know that, it isn't that I engaged with caste only after I read Ambedkar, because we all must admit to ourselves that every day of our lives, we live within this system of caste. So I'm not a Hindu, I'm not a Dalit. I'm the daughter of a Syrian Christian woman and an absent father. I grew up in a little village in Imanam, in communist-ruled Kerala. And yet, all around me, were the fissures and cracks of caste. It was there in our language, it was there in the clothes, it was there in the dance, in the music, in everything. So, as many of you know, the God of Small Things is about caste. But when it happened, of course, people like to just elide that and look at it as a book about children or whatever. But when I read The Annihilation of Caste, suddenly it gave you the tools, the implements to try and understand pedagogically what kind of society it is that we live in. I was electrified. And then I read Gandhi's reply to Ambedkar, and then Ambedkar's reply to Gandhi, which is contained in this text. And though I've never been, a Gandhian, I'm not naturally drawn to piety and piousness and all of that. But, it was a default position. Many of us, I have written things in the past where you do make complimentary references to Gandhi. I have always said that I thought the Salt Satyagraha was an incredible act of political theater, At that time, I didn't know about the 1927 Mahad Satyagraha that preceded the Salt Satyagraha. But anyway, reading Ambedkar sent me back to reading Gandhi. And I mean, it took me all the way back to 1893 when Gandhi first arrived in South Africa. Actually, I've spent quite a lot of time traveling in South Africa and, talking about what Gandhi meant there. And I just began to be astonished at the scale at which there has been some kind of, I don't know, I mean, I can call it cover-up or a deception or it's not that there have not been occasional books written about it, about what happened in South Africa, about Gandhi on caste and so on, but in the public arena, we still continue to be officially a nation whose moral coordinates are defined by Mahatma Gandhi. So when I started reading Gandhi himself, I mean, I was honestly too frightened to get into some kind of analysis or say what I thought myself. I just thought, let me just read Gandhi himself on South Africa, on caste, on workers, on women. And, obviously he's a very complicated and fascinating person and has written a lot. But I just followed this thread of caste back into South Africa, into race, and basically discovered what happened in South Africa in 1893 when he arrived in South Africa. The story that all of us have learned in our school textbooks about Gandhi being thrown out of a train in Pietermaritzburg because he was sitting in a whites-only compartment. It's true, but it's only half the truth. He was sitting in a whites-only compartment because he believed that Indians shouldn't sit with the Kafirs, the blacks. When they started the Indian National Congress, the membership fee was £3, which was such an enormous amount of money. It could only be, it was only the business, the passenger Indians that could afford that amount. There were two kinds of Indians at the time, as Gandhi always hastened to clarify. There were the passenger Indians, the businessmen who came voluntarily to do business, and then there was the indentured worker. And one of the first victories that Gandhi's political campaign won was what was called the solution to the Durban post office problem, which was that there were two entrances to the Durban post office, one for blacks and one for whites. And he got a third entrance opened for Indians so that they wouldn't have to use the entrance that black people used. Anyway, I don't want to get into a long, detailed thing about this, but I just say that these views on caste, that he on race, his collaborations with the British against the black Africans in South Africa, then led to another whole scenario on caste. And he came back to India in 1915, already being called a Mahatma for this work that he had done in Africa, where he continuously wrote very contemptuously of black people, very contemptuously of indentured labor. And those writings are contained here in the introduction. Ambedkar, on the other hand, didn't have to go all the way to South Africa to realize what it was to be discriminated against. He was born into an untouchable Mahar family. When he was in school, and he was only allowed to go to school because of British legislation, he was made to sit on a little piece of gunny sack in the corner of the classroom. He was not allowed to drink water. He was not, the barbers in the town where he grew up would not cut his hair. He was just not allowed access to anything that touchable people had access to. And then when he came eventually to Bombay and went to college and won a scholarship to Columbia and comes back to work, and the clerks are rolling up the carpet so that he doesn't pollute them, and they're throwing files at him so that they don't have to touch him. And this is how one of a man who I think is probably India's most erudite liberal of that time, this was his past. And time and again, it was Ambedkar and Gandhi first met in 1931, actually, at the second roundtable conference. And one of the biographers, Dhananjay Keer, actually writes about this. It's a very, very well-known meeting where Gandhi actually mistook him for a Brahmin because he was so knowledgeable. He knew Sanskrit, he could quote the scriptures, and he asked him why he was so critical of the Congress, which at the time amounted to being critical of the struggle for the homeland. And Ambedkar said, Gandhiji, I have no homeland. No untouchable worth his name could be proud of this land. And yet, in the way our history has been written, you know, he's called an imperial stooge, he's insulted, he's called a collaborator, because he asked these very, very fundamental questions. And many of them are in the Annihilation of Caste. I'm just going to read a small passage from it. He says, I have no desire to ascend the platform of the Hindus, to do within their sight what I have been doing within their hearing. If I'm here, it is because of your choice and not because of my wish. Yours is a cause of social reform. That cause has always made an appeal to me, and it is because of this that I felt I ought not to refuse an opportunity of helping the cause, especially when you think that I can help it. Whether what I'm going to say today will help you in any way to solve the problem that you're grappling with is for you to judge. All I hope to do is to place before you my views on the problem. The path of social reform, like the path to heaven, at any rate in India, is strewn with many difficulties. Social reform in India has few friends and many critics. The critics fall into two distinct classes. One class consists of political reformers and the other of socialists. It was at one time recognized that without social efficiency, no permanent progress in the fields of other fields of activity was possible, that owing to mischief wrought by evil customs, Hindu society was not in a state of efficiency, and that ceaseless efforts must be made to eradicate these evils. It was due to the recognition of this fact that the birth of the National Congress was accompanied by the foundation of the Social Conference. While the Congress was concerned with defining the weak points in the political organization of the country, the Social Conference was engaged in removing the weak points in the social organization of Hindu society. For some time, the Congress and the Conference worked together as two wings of one common activity, and they held their annual sessions in the same pandal. But soon the two wings developed into two parties, a political reform party and a social reform party, between whom there raged a fierce controversy. The political reform party supported the National Congress, and the social reform party supported the Social Conference. The two bodies became hostile camps. The point at issue was whether social reform should precede political reform. For a decade, the forces were evenly balanced, and the battle was fought without victory to either side. It was, however, evident that the fortunes of the Social Conference were ebbing fast. The gentleman who presided over the session of the Social Conference lamented that the majority of the educated Hindus were for political advancement and indifferent to social reform, and that while the number of those who attended the Congress was very large, and the number of those who did not attend but who sympathized with it were even larger, the number of those who attended the Social Conference was very much smaller. Then he talks about a speech delivered by W.C. Banerjee, among the founders of the Indian National Congress in 1892. And he said, this is Mr. Banerjee saying, "I, for one, have no patience with those who say we shall not be fit for political reform until we reform our social system. I fail to see any connection between the two. Are we not fit for political reform because our widows remain unmarried and our girls are given in marriage earlier than in other countries? Because our wives and daughters do not drive about with us visiting friends? Because we do not send our daughters to Oxford and Cambridge?" So this was his understanding of social reform. And then Ambedkar goes on to describe what actually is going on, what he means by social reform. Under the rule of the Peshwas in the Maratha country, the untouchable was not allowed to use the public streets if a Hindu was coming along, lest he should pollute the Hindu by his shadow. The untouchable was required to have a black thread either on his wrist or around his neck as a sign or a mark to prevent the Hindus from getting themselves polluted by mistake. In Pune, the capital of the Peshwa, the untouchable was required to carry, strung from his waist, a broom to sweep away from behind himself the dust he trod on, lest a Hindu walking on the same dust should be polluted. In Pune, the untouchable was required to carry an earthen pot hung around his neck wherever he went, for holding his spit, lest his spit falling on the earth should pollute a Hindu who might unknowingly happen to tread on it. Then he goes on to talk about what is happening with untouchables at that time. And here the annotations will really help you to put this whole thing in context. And in the introduction, I've written about many incidents that are happening today, which could as well have been happening in 1892 or in 1912 or today, Then Ambedkar says, "Having stated the facts, let me now state the case for social reform. In doing so, I will follow Mr. Banerjee as nearly as I can and ask the political-minded Hindus, are you fit for political power, even though you do not allow a large class of your own countrymen, like the untouchables, to use public schools? Are you fit for political power, even though you do not allow them to use the use of public wells? Are you fit for political power, even though you do not allow them the use of public streets? Are you fit for political power, even though you do not allow them to wear what apparel or ornaments they like? Are you fit for political power, even though you do not allow them to eat the food they like? I can ask a string of such questions, but these will suffice. And then he goes on in this incredibly erudite speech of his. But I just could actually stand here and talk to you for hours about this, which I won't do. But instead, before we start this conversation, I'm going to read an essay that Gandhi wrote the same year that Ambedkar wrote The Annihilation of Caste. The introduction actually gives a long history of the lead up to how this speech came to be written, what was the political context, what is the history of the anti-caste movement, how it was, for example, that at the turn of the century, when the idea of empire, when a person could ride into Delhi and take the throne, turned into the empire, the idea of the nation state, the idea of representation, how suddenly, for years and years before that, untouchables had been converting to Christianity, to Islam, to Sikhism. Nobody seemed to mind. There's a wonderful excerpt from something Jyotiba Phule, who was one of Ambedkar's intellectual predecessors, says about, obviously today the contestation about the Hindu rights writing of the history of Islam is about how they desecrated temples and how they murdered and pillaged and so on. And what we call the Hindu left replies with a more moderate account of that. But what Jyotiba Phule says, as an untouchable, he says, yes, they desecrated temples, but thank God they did it. Thank God they did it. They desecrated temples, they invited us to eat with them, they made us equals. Of course, as we know, that isn't strictly speaking true, because today Islam, Sikhism, and Christianity all practice caste, but at least not theologically and theoretically, but certainly in practice. But I want to so Gandhi was a believer earlier in all the minutiae of the caste system, and later on he turned to saying, okay, I believe in the Varna system, which Ambedkar called the parent of the caste system. But he very firmly believed in the idea of ancestral occupations. So when Ambedkar wrote The Annihilation of Caste, Gandhi, who was by then 68 years old, wrote a classic essay called The Ideal Bhangi. And this is what it says. The Brahmin's duty is to look after the sanitation of the soul. The Bhangi is that of the body of society. And yet our woebegone Indian society has branded the Bhangi as a social pariah, set him down at the bottom of the scale, held him fit only to receive kicks and abuse, a creature who must subsist on the leavings of the caste people and dwell on the dung heap. If only we had given due recognition to the status of the Bhangi as equal to that of the Brahmin, our village, no less their inhabitants, would have looked a picture of cleanliness and order. I therefore make bold to state, without any manner of hesitation or doubt, that not till the invidious distinction between Brahmin and Bhangi is removed will our society enjoy health, prosperity, and peace, and be happy. He then outlined the educational requirements, practical skills, and etiquette an ideal Bhangi should possess. What quality, I'm quoting, what qualities therefore should such an honored servant of society exemplify in his person? In my opinion, an ideal Bhangi should have a thorough knowledge of the principles of sanitation. He should know how a right kind of latrine is constructed and the correct way of cleaning it. He should know how to overcome and destroy the odor of excreta and the various disinfectants to render them innocuous. He should likewise know the process of converting urine and night soil into manure. But that is not all. My ideal Bhangi would know the quality of night soil and urine and would keep a close watch on these and give timely warning to the individual concerned. unquote. The Manusmriti says a Shudra should not amass wealth even if he has the ability, for a Shudra who amasses wealth annoys the Brahmin. Gandhi, a Banya for whom the Manusmriti prescribes usury as a divine calling, says, such an ideal Bhangi, while deriving his livelihood from his occupation, would approach it only as a sacred duty. In other words, he would not dream of amassing wealth out of it. Now, 70 years later, in his book, Karma Yogi, which he withdrew after the Valmiki community protested, Narendra Modi proved he was a diligent disciple of the Mahatma. And he says, I do not believe they have been doing this job just to sustain their livelihood. Had this been so, they would not have continued with this kind of job generation after generation. At some point of time, somebody must have got the enlightenment that it is their, Valmiki's, duty to work for the happiness of the entire society and the gods, that they have to do this job bestowed upon them by gods, and this job should continue as internal spiritual activity for centuries. The Naram Dal and the Garam Dal may be separate political parties today, but ideologically they're not as far apart from each other as we think they are. Now, there is a lot to talk about. You know, I mentioned, for example, the Mahad Satyagraha. In 1927, there was something called the Bole Resolution that allowed untouchables and everybody access to public water tanks and so on. I'm just going to read briefly about the Mahad Satyagraha, which preceded the Salt Satyagraha, and I think you could see the influences. In 1923, the Legislative Council of Bombay, whose elections had been boycotted by the Congress, passed a resolution, the Bole Resolution, that allowed untouchables to use public tanks, wells, schools, courts, and dispensaries. In the town of Mahad, the municipality declared that it had no objection if untouchables used the Chavadar tank in the town. Passing a resolution was one thing, acting on it quite another. After 4 years of mobilization, the untouchables gathered courage and in March 1927 held a 2-day conference in Mahad. Money for the conference was raised by public contribution. In an unpublished manuscript, the scholar Anand Teltumre quotes Anand Vinayak Chitre, one of the organizers of the Mahad Satyagraha, saying that 40 villages contributed ₹3 each, and a play about Tukaram was staged in Bombay, and that made 23 rupees, making the total collection of ₹143. Contrast this with Gandhi's troubles. Just a few months before the Mahad Satyagraha, on 10th January 1927, Gandhi wrote to his industrialist patron, G.D. Birla, and I'm quoting, "My thirst for money is simply unquenchable. I need at least ₹2 lakhs for khadi, untouchability, and education. The dairy work makes another 50,000. Then there's the ashram expenditure. No work remains unfinished for want of funds, but God gives after severe trials. This also satisfies me. You can give as you like for whatever work you have faith in." The Mahad conference was attended by about 3,000 untouchables. And by the way, I use this word untouchables as Ambedkar uses it, because he uses it with this cold anger. Anyway, I've explained that in my text, so I'm not using it loosely. The Mahad conference was attended by about 3,000 untouchables and a handful of progressive members of the privileged castes. Veer Savarkar, out of jail by now, was one of the supporters of the Mahad Satyagraha. Ambedkar presided over the meeting. On the morning of the second day, I'm sorry to interrupt myself, but one of the things I think I didn't complete saying was that when this whole anxiety over representation happened, it led to an anxiety of demography. And suddenly, this conversion of the untouchables to Islam and Hinduism became a problem. And that's when this whole host of reform movements sprang up, trying to keep the Dalits in the Hindu fold, keep them in the servants' quarters, but keep them in the Hindu fold. And in fact, the Garam Dal, led by Tilak and with the Hindu Mahasabha and people like Savarkar were very much part of the proselytization of keeping, of sort of the Shuddhi program, for example, run by the Arya Samaj, to keep purified Dalits and bring them into the Hindu fold. And the Congress was doing the same under Gandhi in a different way. So that is why, you know, the presence of, say, someone like Savarkar at the Mahad Satyagraha is interesting, but it's explained in this way. Ambedkar presided over the meeting. On the morning of the second day, people decided to march to the Chavadar tank and drink water. The privileged caste watched in horror as a procession of untouchables walked through the town four abreast and drank water from the tank. After the shock subsided, came the violent counter-attack with clubs and sticks. 20 untouchables were injured. Ambedkar urged his people to stay firm and not to strike back. A rumor was deliberately spread that the untouchables planned to enter the Vireshwar temple, which added a hysterical edge to the violence. The untouchables scattered. Some found shelter in Muslim homes. For his own safety, Ambedkar spent the night in a police station. Once calm returned, the Brahmins purified the tank with prayers and with 108 pots of cow dung, cow urine, milk, curd, and ghee. The symbolic exercise of their rights did not satisfy the Mahad Satyagrahis. In June 1927, an advertisement appeared in Bahishkrit Bharat, Excluded India, a fortnightly that Ambedkar had founded, asking members of the depressed classes who wished to take the agitation further to enlist themselves. And then, basically, there's a second Mahad Satyagraha, where once again they gather, 10,000 people attended this time. And Ambedkar publicly burns the Manusmriti, and then he gives us this extremely stirring speech, which you really should read. I'll just read a little bit of it to you because it's a long one. Gentlemen, he says, you have gathered here today in response to the invitation of the Satyagraha Committee. As the chairman of that committee, I gratefully welcome you all. This lake at Mahad is public property. The caste Hindus of Mahad are so reasonable that they not only draw water from the lake themselves, but freely permit people of any religion to draw water from it, and accordingly people of other religions such as Islam do make use of this permission. Nor do the caste Hindus prevent members of species considered lower than human, such as birds and beasts, from drinking at the lake. Moreover, they freely permit beasts kept by the untouchables to drink at the lake. The caste Hindus of Mahad prevent the untouchables from drinking the water of the Chavadar lake, not because they suppose the touch of the untouchables will pollute the water or that it will evaporate and vanish. The reason for preventing the untouchables from drinking it is that they do not wish to acknowledge by such permission that castes declared inferior by sacred tradition are in fact their equals. It is not as if drinking the water of the Chavadar lake will make us immortal. We have survived well enough all these days without drinking it. We are not going to the Chavadar lake merely to drink its water. We are going to the lake to assert that we too are human beings like others. It must be clear that this meeting has been called to set up the norm of equality. Time and again, Ambedkar returned to the theme of equality. Men may not all be equal, he said, but equality was the only possible governing principle because the classification and assortment of human society was impossible. The thousands attending the conference were in a militant mood. They wanted to defy the court injunction and march to the tank. Ambedkar decided against it, hoping that after hearing the matter, the courts would declare that untouchables did have the right to use public wells. He thought that a judicial order would be a substantial step forward from just a municipal resolution. Although the High Court did eventually lift the injunction, it found a technical way around making the legal declaration in favor of untouchables, like the judge who almost 80 years later wrote the Khairlanji judgment. That same month, in December 1927, Gandhi spoke at an all-India suppressed classes conference in Lahore, where he preached a gospel opposite to Ambedkar's. He urged untouchables to fight for their rights by sweet persuasion and not by satyagraha, which becomes duragraha when it is intended to give rude shock to the deep-rooted prejudices of the people. Duragraha he defined as a devilish force. Ambedkar never forgot Gandhi's response to the Mahad Satyagraha. And in 1945, in what the Congress and Gandhi have done to untouchables, he said, "The untouchables were not without hope of getting the moral support of Mr. Gandhi. Indeed, they had very good ground for getting it. For the weapon of Satyagraha, the essence of which is to melt the heart of the opponent by suffering, was the weapon which was forged by Mr. Gandhi and who had led the Congress to practice it against the British government. Naturally, the untouchables expected full support from Mr. Gandhi to their Satyagraha against the Hindus, the object of which was to establish their right to take water from public wells and to enter public Hindu temples. Mr. Gandhi, however, did not give his support to the Satyagraha. Not only did he not give his support, he condemned it in strong terms." Anyway, it's, I think, something that we all have to be very, very ashamed of, that all these years we have allowed this myth to go on and on and on. I just think that it has to stop now. It has to stop, and by no standards. We have, there's much that I've written about what I call the project of unseeing, where even the left has just acted as if caste doesn't exist. There's a whole section in the introduction about how caste and capitalism coexist so beautifully. Who owns the media, who owns the corporations, who's in the judiciary, who's in the bureaucracy, who's in the academia. All of this, there is empirical data in this book. And now I think I'll just stop and have a conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anand.
Is this on? Yeah.
It's an honor. Also an honor to share space with Arundhati Roy, who I have known by and large till recently. Sorry. I wanted to thank Anand for providing this opportunity, and also for sharing space with Arundhati, who I have known till recently only through her writings. And for me, she is what she writes. Also, for the first time in my life, I heard the voice of Ambedkar, the audio that was played out. Thanks for that. Very few texts of social criticism and political polemic have had such a checkered career and such a long life as Annihilation of Caste by Ambedkar. Books may last for decades on the shelves, maybe centuries, but after some time they stop speaking. Their message, their mazmoon, stops resonating with the reader. Now, why this has happened, this has not happened with Annihilation of Caste, is primarily, in my opinion, because the conditions to which it addresses itself still exist. The structures of oppression and inequality that it writes about are still there in place. Of course, a lot of things have changed. A lot of new things have come into play. But as in a debate with Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, they were having a very bitter debate about Marxism. And at one stage, Sartre says that Marxism is a theory of capitalism and as a social philosophy cannot be transcended unless the conditions of capitalism themselves could be transcended. So herein lies the importance of Ambedkar's text. It demands serious engagement, and we all know Arundhati has never been shy of such engagements. By way of starting this brief conversation, if I could ask her this simple question, why so late? Why so late? I know the impulse must be there for some time, but this couldn't just be a push, a friendly push from a concerned publisher, I'm sure.
Well, I think the answer to that is, look, I'm not an academic, I'm not a historian. I don't necessarily I still don't necessarily see this as my duty or something that I have to do. Even though it's been a long time since I've written my next book of fiction, it's been a long time that I'm just trying to write it, and then I keep getting interrupted by real life, But so I don't think, I don't think I can answer that question, because it's not, it's a question addressed to everybody, right? Anybody else could have done it. It's not that I had to, the world was not waiting for me to do it. There's nothing special about my doing it. And as we know, there are so many editions, there's so much commentary on this book before, And for me, fundamentally, I'm not somebody who, I would like to absorb the annihilation of caste into my cellular structure, and I would like it to come out in everything I say or how I write or what I do. It's not an issue for me. It's not that I'm going to now become an Ambedkar scholar, It's that Ambedkar's way of seeing will be in my eyes, I will, just as when I go to Kashmir, I don't come back and become a person who just starts a little industry of Kashmir ki azadi, It's just that those things go into your blood as a writer, and then they inform everything that you do. And it is true that there is hardly anything I've written where one doesn't at least refer to how caste works in our country, and primarily, of course, as I said, the God of small things. But I think we all have to take great cognizance of this, and it's late for all of us. It would be very, very pompous of me to assume that it was my responsibility to do this and I've been late in doing it, It's something that has to do with all of us.
Well, in a way, as you said, God of small things is also about caste. In that sense, this engagement is not new. Now, you have been on the road with this book recently, and like all road journeys, you might have expected some difficulties. So what has been the experience so far? What's your sense of audience response on this book?
Well, I think what's interesting about the book and perhaps the introduction is that it confounds our normal ways in which we have lazily divided up society in political terms. It confuses us about now what is the left wing and what is the right wing and what is the middle wing and who are the moderates and who are the liberals. So I think it'll take a little bit of time for people to gather their forces and know who and where and which direction to attack it from, because I think one of the things that will disturb many liberals is the fact that, especially today when the right wing is on the ascendant, when Modi is on the ascendant, when people are so worried about about a form of, our own form of fascism coming to power, I've been asked, are you handing Gandhi over to the right? And I said, look, Gandhi is not a stuffed toy. I can't hand him, I'm nobody to hand him over to anyone. But in the matter of caste, it's really very interesting that you cannot, it doesn't play by the rules of everything else. If you look at the description of what happened in the Puna Pact, I mean, this is a very fascinating story of how Gandhi was constantly thwarting Ambedkar's one desire to see the Dalits developed into a political community who had the right to represent themselves. He always wanted the missionary position. You be the victim, I'll be the missionary. Let me look after you and let me, that kind of thing. And so after the Round Table Conference, when the British actually gave Dalits a special separate electorate, Gandhi went on a hunger fast, and it was what Ambedkar called a form of barefaced blackmail almost. And Ambedkar had to pull back. Now, if you look at the signatories of the Puna Pact, who were they? There was G.D. Birla, who sponsored Gandhi from 1915 to the end of his life. There was Madan Mohan Malviya. There was V. Savarkar, accused of the assassination of Gandhi. Birla was Gandhi's sponsor. He was also funding the Arya Samaj Shuddhi movement to purify Dalits and Adivasis. He also then campaigned later, when the RSS was banned after the assassination of Gandhi. He was one of the people who campaigned to unban the RSS. So, the connections are very interesting, and not, we can't just easily categorize this politics. So I think, of course, coming back to the current thing, as Anand mentioned, there has been one section of Dalits who maintain that only a Dalit can write the introduction, and that it's been misrepresented. Some people say there cannot be any annotation, all that, which are interesting debates and which I have actually responded to quite formally. But, they are basically positions, they are not arguments, that it's like, will then the Gujarati Banya say only we can represent Gandhi, or someone else will say only the Mahars can represent Ambedkar accurately. And these are debates which the feminist movements, the anti-apartheid movement, the black movement in Africa, in the civil rights movement in the US, all these issues have been debated. And it's very interesting in the issue of caste, because Ambedkar, I just want to read one of the things he says, because it really speaks to this. But this is the thing about him, he's so relevant. We can just keep quoting him to make our points. Ambedkar says, he's describing Brahmanism, and he's calling it and he says under Brahmanism, there is no such class as a completely unprivileged class, except the one which is at the base of the social pyramid. The privileges of the rest are graded. Even the low is privileged as compared with the lower. Each class being privileged, every class is interested in maintaining the system. So actually, you look at the system of caste, it's like a surveillance system where everybody is sort of asked to spy on the next person, and everybody has some interest in maintaining the status quo. So it's a hellishly difficult social system in which to organize politically. As I said, Mao, how famously he said, Chairman Mao said that, a single spark can light a prairie fire. But we have, instead of a prairie, a labyrinth. And the single spark just keeps getting caught in this labyrinth and doesn't know what to do because of caste.
Well, a question about Gandhi. You see, as we said, much water has flown since Ambedkar-Gandhi debate. Gandhi today, don't you think that is not such a powerful live presence? in national life or in our own consciousness, as for example Ambedkar is. He may be father of the nation and an international icon, but the ground on which he stood and the ground on which these debates took place has really disappeared. The center itself has shifted so much rightwards that the ruling set, the ruling classes today do not really need Gandhi to justify the status quo. In the era of these changes, globalization, and these strong communal mobilizations that are going on, and the other social changes that have occurred, a kind of a state welfareism for a certain period of time, the rise of OBC politics, certain betterment in the conditions of bondage, etc. Today's society is at a stage where the main dangers are coming from different quarters and they are represented by different forces. Today, what we see as the forces of Hindu right, their ideas and their actions impinge more on the caste question than Gandhi's. So may I ask this question, why is so much focus on Gandhi?
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of this introduction, if you look at it, it's you know, again here I can quote you Ambedkar on the importance of why he chooses to reply only to Gandhi, even though there are many people who criticize his views, and he says he's the oracle of the Hindus. And so today, surely, you know, he has shifted, he has lost relevance, and yet in other ways he's gained relevance. You know, I mean, I watch the news, I read the news, and I see how often there are references to him. Even now, they are fighting over who killed Gandhi. You know, if you read the caravan story about Swami Asimanand, who's proud of being in Golwalkar's brother's cell or something, but in his ashram, the boys were made to chant every day the Ekta mantra. Swami Asimanand, the person who's been accused of the Samjhauta Express blasts I'm talking about, who's a functionary of the RSS. And the boys in his ashram are made to chant the Ekta mantra, which includes Gandhi and Golwalkar. You know, so was this an ideological killing? Was it a fratricidal killing? You know, these are debates that at least these are questions that I have asked in this. But I think, you know, what happens is that Gandhi is the mascot. And however far we move materially from Gandhi, we use him like, you know, Catholics use confession to somehow give us, you know, make a moral position. So the Indian government is busy right now trying to get Gandhi statues put up all over North America, for example, you know. So I don't think that we can minimize the importance of Gandhi. Yet, when we're talking about how things have shifted, again, I think there's quite a long part in my essay about how caste works today. And the debates about some people saying, oh, globalization, urbanization, all these things have actually, you know, neutralized caste. And others saying, no, but caste is very important because it doesn't atomize Indian society. I mean, no Dalits are saying this, but, you know, others are. It has its buoyant supporters still. Caste does. So I think you know, that would be an answer to the question. If you just see how caste and capitalism and corporatism play out today, it's pretty shocking. You know, who owns the newspapers? Just look at those things. You know, it's amazing, the ownership. We are all quite fond of talking about Dalit dispossession, Adivasis, what's happening, but for instance, nobody turns that gaze upwards, you know. What are the Banyas up to? What are the Brahmins up to? You know, who is in the judiciary, who is in the bureaucracy? It tells a deadly tale, you know, when you look at it that way. When you just turn that searchlight away from the victims to the perpetrators, it tells another story.
Yeah, of course, but the question that starts worrying people inside Dalit movement itself, the people who are involved with Dalit studies, or anybody who is studying social exclusion, is the extent and this whole politics of assimilation, co-option. There are glaring instances of the co-option of Dalits, a section of Dalit masses, into communal mobilizations, into genocidal violence. And the other side is that there are a whole sector of Dalit thinkers who think globalization has been a boon, is good for Dalits. It will destroy caste by itself. The Macaulay is the Mahatma, along with Ambedkar. Now, this degree of co-option also worries me sometimes because they often find legitimacy within Ambedkar's ideas. At one point in the book you have written that Ambedkar's circumstances were such that he was a revolutionary rebel, but at the same time had to, you know, keep his one foot in the establishment whenever occasion arose, which is a very true description of his state. But in the era of Kashiram, later Mayavati, and politicians like these, today's Dalit politics as it plays out on the ground, there is no ethical or political, what you call, censor, any inbuilt mechanism in the Ambedkarism in practice that stops Dalits from being part of these sometimes opportunistic and often thoroughly anti-democratic alliances. This is one question that will not go away very easily because we see it happening every day. So sometimes I wonder that as a thinker, as a philosopher, perhaps Ambedkar did not really think through his strategies. His assertion on immediate empowerment took away all his attention from the long-term consequences of this strategy.
See, I think this is a very complicated question to answer, but it doesn't apply just to Dalits, no, it applies to all of us. Because there are so many of us who are critics of capitalism, but we have to live in a capitalist society and we are not pure anti-capitalist because it's not possible to be. And all the more so, if you're a marginalized person, you don't have that choice of purity or being the pure revolutionary just as much as you don't have the choice of being the pure victim. And I have written about that dual legacy that Ambedkar left, you know, the person who was on the drafting committee of the Constitution, even though he himself was unhappy with many parts of the Constitution, and then the person who wrote the revolutionary and liberating Annihilation of Caste, and sometimes that legacy can be confusing. Then there's the other thing which comes, the question about, you know, parties, political parties like the BSP and Kanshiram, Mayavati. Now the thing is that I think the Puna Pact and how it looked at electoral representation and what Ambedkar was trying to say and how he was thwarted in that, even in his own political activity later, is a very, very interesting thing, you know, because that, what he was trying to say when he asked for the dual vote was that, look, even just demographically, the way Dalits are organized, you know, on the edges of villages and so on, they cannot form a political majority, you know. So he had worked out the system where they could have a double vote, where far from dividing things up, he was saying it would help them to be invested in the system, and yet if they could vote within their own electorate to form a political leadership. But now, you know, even Kanshiram and Mayawati, because of the way voting is structured, they cannot have a political majority without making alliances that anyway water down what they actually believe in. And in spite of that, you know, of course, there are allegations of corruption, but against them much more shrill than against others who are making much more money. But then Mayawati is a woman and a single woman and a Dalit, and so the shrillness of that allegation, the ugliness of it is sharpened, you know. But the fact is that they have done a lot to bring the idea of Dalit dignity into the mainstream. But for all of us, I mean, not just for Dalits, all of us are in a mess. You know, how do we make a revolution, or how do we understand the way things are, and how do we act against them? How do we deal with the NGOization of politics? All of these are questions that apply to all of us. So I think I'd be cautious of only blame. I mean, when Dalit capitalism is celebrated, you know, just like I think there's no harm in them being capitalists. Maybe you could be a capitalist and not celebrate the idea of capitalism, but say that, look, this is how we have to survive here in this society now. We are not pure people. None of us are. I mean, for everything I say, I'm a writer whose books sell a lot, who has a bank account, who is not, you know, starving on the streets, or not being, you know, I can be accused of all sorts of things, but looking, how do we live in our society? You know, how do we try to live with a modicum of integrity without being pure, you know, and pious and giving up everything and then becoming like a boutique item, you know?
Yeah, surely I understand that. But there are dark recesses, dark corners in Ambedkar's thought, as there are in Gandhi's, as we saw. So the people who we regard as liberators are also victims of history. They are not always in command of history. I'll give you two instances, in fact just one. Ambedkar's thought on Muslim, his notion of Islam, his understanding of the history of Muslims in South Asia, his conceptualization of Muslim identity in South Asia, when you go through work, particularly his work on Pakistan and the partition, where he also, in good detail, reveals his understanding of this history, is straight out of an Orientalist approach to a 19th century British colonial historian's approach to this question. He simply has borrowed that vision. He treats them as almost like a separate species, without any fractures within, without any other desire than being Muslim. And basically his notion of Hindus and Muslims as two separate communities, as two separate almost nations, matches dangerously with that of Savarkar. It is there. And it's not there in just one comment or one casual remark. It forms his, his understanding. Also, his views on Adivasis are quite different from his views on caste and Dalits. These are the things that also forces one to consider Ambedkar not just a liberator, but also a human being, as a thinker with great flaws, and whose thought have to be approached with the same critical awareness as we approach, say, the ideas of Gandhi or Nehru or anybody else. And this brings me to this whole question of Mahatmaism, Mahatmahood.
Can I just answer that
slightly,
briefly? I just want to say that I think that, of course, Ambedkar needs to be scrutinized with scholarship, with questions and all that. But first of all, at least we have to bring him into the light, before we start questioning things. And I think it is only respect for someone that you give somebody scholarly attention, you argue with him, and you don't just worship him from a distance and say everything you say is right, And I think all of us are such flawed beings, all of us. I mean, there isn't any perfect philosopher or perfect person beyond any perfect human being. And of course, in Annihilation of Caste itself, there are passages on Adivasis that he writes where the language used is very similar to the language in which Gandhi describes untouchables, So these are things that we do need to talk about and not shy away from. And I think you're absolutely right there.
Now this whole business of Mahatmaism and deification and the sainthood, where does Ambedkar stand today? Do we need to watch out against similar deification and fossilization? Who can and cannot speak of Ambedkar or for Ambedkar? It's a big question, and this is every time a non-Dalit starts talking about it, the very first hurdle, at the very first point, this question comes up. You have partly talked about it, perhaps you have had personal experience, but the problem goes much further. Should we confine Ambedkar, as you say, to that small room, or is he a thinker for whole mankind, whole humanity? And when you look at him as a thinker for whole of India, for the whole world, then obviously these questions, these problems will come up. So therefore, he cannot just be turned into a deity as a sacred symbol of Dalitism, but also a major, among the builders, makers of modern India, and like other makers of modern India, he deserves a bit of Mahatmaism and a bit of scholarship, and at the same time a bit of a deconstruction as well, like all Mahatmas deserve.
Absolutely, absolutely, I agree, and I think that it is respectful to someone to give him the benefit or her the benefit of scholarship, and though again, it's conflicted, because in the apartheid society that we live in, the fact that, in some ways he seems a man of dangerous ideas, to the establishment, and therefore he's ghettoized. When he's ghettoized, he's glorified in the ghetto, and then celebrated for not his revolutionary ideas outside. These are things I've sort of written about as well. But I completely agree with you, and unfortunately our trouble now, I think, in India is that we are approaching an age where, when in the 19th century what Dalit could say about his relationship with Islam, or what Manto could say about his faith, or what Ambedkar could say about Hinduism, or what Nehru could say about Kashmir, we can't say. We talk a lot about free speech, but do we have free speech? Can we think freely? You have to write things, sort of combing them for tweetable sentences, and we're just hemming ourselves in a way where our minds would end up in tweets. It's really very sad.